Hi, I'm Tanya Harris, and I'm a Mending the Soul clinician, a live training instructor, and the director of small group training. I love Mending the Soul because it's how I did my own healing. And so then it's been really amazing as originally a lay facilitator to walk beside others in their healing. And now as a professional clinician, I get to continue to walk alongside people as they do their healing.
My name is Brandy Powell, and I'm the adult small group administrator for Mending the Soul. I'm also a certified trainer and the Skype team leader. I love Mending the Soul because of the connection that it creates between people. I am a survivor myself, and to be able to speak with other survivors and help them find the same healing I was able to find, it's a joy and a passion, and I'm grateful for that opportunity.
Today we're going to be talking about what is best practice for leading Mending the Soul groups. The first thing that you think of when you think of doing best practice with Mending the Soul groups is having well-trained facilitators. And a real key to this is to do the work for yourself first. So this basically means you're going to go through the book and the workbook for yourself and do the work for you first. You also want to use the materials and your time wisely. You'll be using the textbook, the Mending the Soul workbook, and the Mending the Soul facilitator to guide you through the group process. And the final key to best practice that we'll be covering today is having safely structured groups.
So, what are facilitators? Facilitators are people who facilitate Mending the Soul groups. And in order to do that, you have to first participate in a Mending the Soul group yourself. Well, why? Can you imagine trying to teach your child to swim, never having been in the water yourself? We need to experience healing for ourselves first. We need to do the reading and the exercises for ourselves. Otherwise, we will not be seen as trustworthy. And participants may ask, when you're going through this group process, how did you answer this question, or what did you struggle with? Not doing the work yourselves first creates an us versus them mentality and is isolating and shaming. So doing it for ourselves creates safety and community. It has a deep impact on the understanding and importance of the materials. It impacts your heart.
One thing I just wanted to add to, Brandy, is I've actually had participants say after we've shared our stories as facilitators that it just makes them feel like you really get it, you really understand it, and then it makes it feel safe for them to then share their story because they really know that you've gotten it. And you really can't do that if you haven't done all those steps that you were just talking about.
Another part of MTS best practice with facilitators is to have attended an MTS basic training. Why? Well, this is where the head connects to the heart and you learn why all the things you experienced in your own group worked or did not work. You learn how to actually do these groups safely. The MTS models are all researched and field tested, and this is where you will learn this valuable knowledge to implement in your own facilitation. Some training options are attending a live training, or doing a DVD with a certified trainer present, or also watching the DVDs on your own.
And you can find those options on the website. Next, we'll be talking about the importance of two facilitators. It is very important that when you facilitate groups that you're facilitating with two facilitators, if at all possible. The reason why this is important is it creates that sense of community between you and your co-facilitator. It gives like a visual representation of a healthy, connected relationship. They probably haven't seen that maybe in their family growing up or in recent relationships. So it gives them that picture of what that looks like. It's also biblical when you think of the scripture from Ecclesiastes, why are two better than one? And also it shares the workload, and also different facilitators have different gifts. So I might notice a certain set of things happening in the group, and my co-facilitator will notice something different happening. And we're both there to share that work of responding and guiding and observing. Just one example I wanted to share of that is that, one time leading a group, I was really focused on a participant that was sharing a memory or a little bit of their story, and I was so focused on them that I didn't even notice that someone else in the group further along in the circle that I wasn't seeing visually was getting really triggered by what the other participant was saying. But my co-facilitator was scanning the group and noticed that. And so when the one person that I was focused on finished sharing, then she was able to take a few minutes to check in with that other person. I noticed this was going on. Would you mind sharing what you were feeling? And that would have actually been completely missed if I wouldn't have had a co-facilitator, because I didn't see it happening, but my co-facilitator did. So that's just a really good example of why it's so important to have two facilitators.
I think also having that time after group to be able to debrief with one another and talk about what we experienced, what connections were made, how the group is developing, are things being kept safe. Just having that other person to talk to and to review the evening is so important.
Absolutely.
So time goes by fast. How do we use it well? Well, spending time on both the book and the workbook, it's not really a black and white issue. Generally, spending about 30 to 45 minutes on the book and having some discussion around it is really appropriate. The rest of the time should be spent utilizing the workbook. What is best practice for sharing your story? So facilitators will share their stories in week 1. Why do they share their stories? Well, it's important because it models how to do it for the participants, and this creates safety. One of our former participants once said, "When you shared your story, it made me feel like you got it. If my facilitator has their own story, then there is the possibility they will respond safely to me when I share." So what are some ways to safely share stories?
So like Brandy said, we definitely want the facilitators going first. So you want the facilitators to share their stories first. Usually that's in the first week of the group. How I like to do it is after that first week, when facilitators share their stories, then I divide it up and I have the participants, half the participants share their story in week 2, and the other half share their story on week 3. And then doing that also still allows time to cover the materials in the workbook. And I also feel that the stories go well with the content of what's in the workbook. It goes well with the timeline and the wheel of abuse. And so it just integrates really well. And, but I have heard other people sometimes like to have everybody share their story on week 1, and there's some advantages to doing that. Everybody knows where everyone's at and has heard their story, and it really starts to connect and bond the group together really well. And so that's another option.
I know, Tanya, I really like to have my group sign up which week that they would like to tell their story. And then that's one participant per group, and it gives the floor to just them for that evening. And sometimes that really gives them the space to be able to share those things that they haven't shared with anybody. So I really like doing it, just giving the floor to one participant per group.
The idea is just that everybody shares their story. You keep it safe, you respond well, and then you have some parameters around the time as well.
Right. You want to have a general time limit for how long the story should be, and usually that's about 10 minutes. So when that 10 minutes is coming to a close, gently let them know that they have a couple minutes to finish up their story. We don't want it to go too long. It can be very triggering for some other participants, and then that can become an unsafe group. So why do participants share their story? Well, it's important for them to share at least some of their story because it starts to decrease the isolation that survivors feel. It also helps the participant to know that their pain and their story is real and it has an impact. It also begins to decrease toxic shame in self and others as a participant connects when they hear other stories and begin to see common threads throughout their life despite the differences among them. Keep your eye on that clock without using any kind of timer or alarm. Generally stay focused on the materials, but be sensitive to a participant who needs some time to share about something current or relevant in their lives. Don't add any additional content to the group, as there is plenty to cover, and when you add content, remember you're changing the model.
Now we're going to take some time to practice. And what we want you to do is stop the video and write some of your story of pain or abuse. If you're watching this with someone, take time after writing for each of you to share your story with the other, and then for the listener to respond with what pieces of the story they connected with. You want to take time to affirm each other and validate each other after sharing your stories. Reflect on these questions. How did it feel to share your story? Did you feel safe? Is there anything that could help you with feeling more safe as you share your story? What was it like to be the listener and the person offering validation? Now pause the video.
Welcome back. So now we're on to using the resources in your groups. So how do you use the textbook in the group? Take some pieces of each chapter and discuss. Ask the participants their reactions from some questions. For example, maybe ask, how did you feel about the characteristics of abusers? Or, what person's story did you identify with most in this chapter? Ask the group which part of the book impacted them the most. Do not just reteach the book. Really interact with it.
For the next part of the group, you'll want to spend time focusing on the workbook, and we'll talk about how to use the workbook in your groups. What you want to do is prior to the group, you want to look through the chapter of the workbook and select some of the exercises that you think really capture and illustrate the key concepts of that chapter. So an example would be in chapter 2, the wheel of abuse really captures the key concepts for that chapter. So that might be one of the exercises you select to go over during the group, or the list of symptoms of shame in chapter 5. You do not want to go through every exercise in the workbook. This will take a very, very long time. It will feel really stiff and rigid, and you'll run out of time, or the group will end up going way more than 2 hours. So that's not the best way. What you want to remember is that the key is that people are connecting and sharing, and their relationships together in the group is one of the healing factors, not sharing on every exercise. So just pick out those key exercises. Also ask participants which exercise spoke the most to them. Sometimes it'll really surprise you which exercise spoke the most to them. Or ask them if any of the exercises confuse them and that they have questions about them. Why do you want to use both resources? Well, it's important that you're using both the book and the workbook. The book, the textbook, is like that head knowledge where you're learning about trauma, you're learning about abuse, you're reading other people's stories. But the workbook integrates in the heart. And so you're integrating in your head knowledge with your heart knowledge and connecting to your feelings and connecting to yourself and others in that process. And it brings in the feelings.
So Tanya, let's role play.
Okay.
All right.
So you're going to be the facilitator, and I will be the participant.
That's right.
Okay.
All right. So on task 2, label shame as shame. Tanya, if we're looking over what you did in the workbook this week, tell me a little bit about what popped up for you, the current shame that you tend to deal with.
So you want to know what I'm dealing with right now, or what I used to struggle with?
Right now.
Okay. Well, man, when I read through this list, I feel like I actually struggle with all of it, but I'll narrow it down a little bit. I definitely struggle with comparison and competition. I totally numb my feelings, absolutely, 100%. I can be really critical, especially of my family and of others, and even of myself, too. And I get super defensive when people criticize me.
So if we're looking over that list, how does it make you feel to see all of those highlights and those underlines on that list?
Well, it's pretty enlightening. I'm not sure I even realized I struggled with shame so much until I was reading through this list. It's kind of hard to accept. It feels a little overwhelming, but it also kind of helps me realize why I'm doing that stuff and makes me feel like I'm not just defective or screwed up because of it. Maybe it's related to my story.
That's right. Thank you for sharing that, Tanya.
Next, we want to share a little bit about the Facilitator and Pastor's Guide. These are 2 resources available to you as well that you should be using when you're facilitating groups. The facilitator guide walks you through exactly how to do groups from start to finish. It's really important that you use this. This book is well researched and it works. They've researched exactly how these groups work best and field tested it, and all that information has been put in the facilitator guide. The pastor's guide shares why having an abuse healing ministry is so important in your church or ministry organization. So it's a real key to use with the church leaders or organizational leaders on why having an abuse healing ministry is so important. After you spent time in the book, you also want to spend time in the workbook during the group. It's important to remember that ideally participants will be doing all the exercises in the workbook. There may be ones they skip over though if they are unsure about it or don't feel safe answering it at that time, and that's totally fine. And we actually will address that in a later webinar in the nuts and bolts of groups. But during the group, you'll only want to cover key exercises. So before the group, I really recommend touching base with your facilitator and just asking, hey, what exercises do you think we should cover this week? What key exercises? Be sure when you pick those, though, that it's optional whether or not the person wants to share on it. You're just picking those key exercises that really summarize the essence of the chapter. So, for example, in chapter 2, I think the wheel of abuse really summarizes a lot of what that chapter is about. Or in chapter 5, the list of symptoms of shame and some of the artwork really summarize what the essence of that chapter is about. So you want to remember not to go through each question in the workbook. So like I said before, you'll identify those key exercises, highlight those points. But if you spend time going through every exercise in the workbook, it will feel really rigid. Not everybody will have time to share, and the group, you will not have time to finish in 2 hours. So you need to have that balance.
Okay, so wrapping up today, some key points about best practice. Being a well-trained facilitator is key to having a great small group. Also, doing the work for yourself first before you even launch into facilitating that group. Make sure that you use those materials and time wisely, and keep those groups always safely structured. Thank you for joining us.